Welcome, everyone. I'm Laura Muir, Associate Director of Academic and Public Programs and a Research Curator at the Harvard Art Museums, and I will serve as a moderator for our Q&A later on. I want to begin by acknowledging that Harvard University is situated on the traditional and ancestral territory of the Massachusetts people, and we strive to honor this relationship. Thank you all for joining us today for this session in our series Art Studies Center Seminars at Home. This is an opportunity for us to share the Harvard Art Museum's collection, as well as the diverse perspectives and expertise of our staff. And occasionally we are also able to welcome special guests. Over the past 5 years, we have offered these sessions in our Art Study Center to small groups of no more than 15 participants. By presenting these online, we can share this live program with a much larger audience while hopefully keeping a sense of intimacy in the spirit of close looking of those in-person sessions. Next, I'd like to quickly go over some logistics. If we could go to the next slide, we are using the webinar format in Zoom. So you will notice that your microphones are muted and your videos are not visible. Instead, we invite you to submit brief questions for our presenters via the Q&A box, which you should be able to access at the bottom of your screen. The presentation will last about 35 minutes, and we will dedicate the last portion of the seminar to Q&A. And I will do my best to get to every question, but we do have a large group today, so I may not be able to get to all of them. And feel free to put your questions in the Q&A box during the presentation, but we probably won't answer them until the end. One other note for today, we have closed captioning available for today's seminar. And to follow along with captions, you can click the closed caption button at the bottom of your screen. So today we are very fortunate to have as a special guest, the Washington, D.C. based artist and photographer, Larry Cook. Larry was recently awarded a grant from the Harvard University Committee on the Arts for his work exploring themes of racial justice in both his art and in his teaching at Howard University, where he is an assistant professor of photography. In this session, we will take a close look at some of his work, which engages with issues of Black masculinity, Black culture, racial stereotypes, and carceral aesthetics. He is joined by my colleague, Makeda Best, who is the Richard L. Menschel Curator of Photography at the Harvard Art Museums. So with that, I will turn it over to Makeda and Larry.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you so much to everyone for being here. Thank you, Larry. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. So, Larry, tell us about when you started to make photographs. Was this something that early on in your life you were drawn to? Was it part of a mix of other artistic interests? Why photography for you?
It's kind of divided into kind of different parts. I think early on, my first, in terms of where my relationship with photography began, was in high school. I would always kind of carry around one of those disposable cameras, and I always take images of friends. And I'm not sure what kind of drove that. It was just something about, one, it allowed me to kind of, be cool in a sense, and allow me to kind of engage with people in terms of classmates and friends. But also, the first photographer or the photographer that was in my family was my grandfather. So he would always, at family functions and events, would always have a camera or video camera. So I think that kind of carried over a little bit. Though I didn't really think about it in terms of fine art photography or even in the sense of a career. But I would say it started then. So that was one experience. Then the other experience was being a club photographer on the DC club scene, setting up photo booths with backdrops and being more of a commercial photographer in that sense. So I would say that's primarily the foundation in terms of how I began to get into photography.
Were you at that time looking at other photographers? Were you thinking about, was your learning about photography a context of family photos, or were there other photographers that you were looking at? And did you grow up in the DC area?
Yeah, I grew up right outside of DC in PG County. Like I said, I really wasn't immersed in the fine art scene, or I really wasn't familiar with any photographers at the time. And my first love, my first passion was basketball. It wasn't until I entered a fine art program at Plattsburgh State University where that education began. And one of the first photographers, of course, as a lot of photographers who are introduced to Gordon Parks, Carrie Mae Weems. So those were some of the early influences, and seeing work that I could really connect to and resonate with.
It's really interesting that you started out in doing this. I mean, your first kind of job, besides making the photographs as a high schooler, was this club photography, which I love to come back to, because it really seems like that experience must have helped you in understanding bodies and space and poses. Learning in that environment how to photograph really seems to have, aided your vision in some ways. So I'd love to come back to that later. So right now you teach at Howard University. I'm curious about how teaching impacts your art. I know that I teach as a curator, and it's just so valuable for me to be able to understand how young people view this medium. Was teaching something that you envisioned yourself doing when you were in graduate school? Was that the path that you wanted to take? And how has teaching impacted your art?
Yeah, I mean, it was really since I would say undergrad, I kind of knew I wanted to teach. I think it was primarily as a result of the impact that, teachers that I had in college, also in high school, impact that they had on me. When I was in high school, I didn't really think a lot about college, but I had great teachers that saw the potential and really kind of planted the idea in my mind and kind of gave me the confidence. So I always wanted to kind of do and provide that for others as well. So, being able to work at Howard is really, in a lot of ways, a dream come true. As artists, the focus is always on us as individuals, in terms of our brilliance, what we create. So being able to balance that ego, if you will, in this kind of act of service, it's been really gratifying and rewarding in ways that I couldn't have imagined. And what also does in terms of my practice is it forces me to always engage in the medium of photography, in terms of being aware of new technologies and trends, and just being knowledgeable and researching historical photographers and contemporary photographers. So it doesn't allow me to be stagnant within my own practice.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. It is really wonderful to discover through a younger generation what this medium means to them, and then to think for yourself how it also is evolving. So you earned your MFA at George Washington University, and we were just talking before this about how we were both around GW at the same time. I was working as a postdoc fellow for the Phillips Collection and teaching a class at GW, and we were actually there at the same time. You just started your second semester there. So in that, you make this body of work, All American, a really fascinating portrait series that, we're all at this moment in time, in this context. I know you've spoken about the role of the killing of Trayvon Martin in the creation of this series. Can you just tell us a little bit about this?
Yeah, so really this work was inspired by that particular event. And in part it was, I just couldn't, at the time, come to terms why there was such a disparity in responses between racially motivated violence and the violence that happens within Black communities. So I wanted to create a piece that really put those things on the same playing field, if you will. So taking the face of Black on Black violence in the sense of, the gangs represented here by the Bloods and Crips, in the face of white on Black violence with the KKK. So, this series was also really important because it began to mark a shift in my practice. Primarily before this particular piece, a lot of my photography was more documentary based. So this kind of allowed me to kind of have a lot more agency and kind of control in terms of the production of the image and in terms of using a more staged photographic practice. So at the time, I was being inspired by, photographers like Carrie Mae Weems and Renee Cox. And I kind of embarked on this particular triptych, which was one of the more interesting shoots. Because everything is staged from the clothing. I had the Klansman robe made. It was tailored to fit my professor at the time. And, it was one of those things that, I want to put this on the same level to allow the viewer to make connections between these subgroups. And, as I began to investigate, obviously there were a lot of similarities in terms of these various codes embedded in the dress, the hand gestures, also how it just kind of is a representation of, particular subculture in America. And, these subcultures are oftentimes, the shadow of America, which is, kind of symbolized in the red, white, and blue that we see here. So this was just really important in the sense of allowing me to think more conceptually in terms of my practice as a photographer, but also allow me to address more social and political issues.
There was a freedom there in terms of you as an artist being able to discover how you could manipulate and use actually the space of the image to say what you needed to say.
Mm-hmm.
What was it? So you said that they're all staged. Like, what was it like for your sitters to engage with you? And this is perhaps a question that we could come back to in other images, because I'm so curious about the people that your sitters or your subjects, mm-hmm. And what their relationship is with you, and how these portrait sittings are, the process of them and the way that you engage your subjects.
One, it reflects a trust in terms of my relationship with the subjects and being able to, perform in this particular manner and trusting that, my idea in terms of my integrity and what I want to represent and say will remain true based on the conversations that we've had. Particularly like the image in the middle, like I said, it took a lot of trust from my professor to be willing to participate in the context of this particular photograph. It was one that wasn't always, it wasn't really easy. It was in a lot of ways uncomfortable. And as I say often in this discussing this work, it was one of the fastest photo shoots that I ever did. We're out in the field in Upper Marlboro, Maryland, and it's probably about 6 a.m. And there's cars literally stopping, and I have assistants who have to engage with these people because they're wondering what's happening in this field. But again, I think that based on the concept and what I was trying to achieve, that with everyone in this particular piece, it was more of a collaborative effort. Even when we were doing particular shoots, if it was the Crip or the Klansmen, we were all present. So we were all really supportive. And it was largely a team effort.
You've described your work as, quote, asking the viewer to look at certain symbols in a different way to enlighten people and raise their consciousness. One of the things that I think about that quote when I look at these, because the sitters, they are it's almost as if they feel vulnerable to how the world would see them, like they know that. And there's that trust is there too, that they understand that they're vulnerable and in taking on this persona or in looking this way, and they are trusting of your vision here. And so I think that that's also why, for me, one of the reasons why these portraits are so moving. That kind of awareness that these sitters seem to have of how they look to the outside world and what is being assigned to them. And I think of that also in this series, your fatherhood series as well, that same quote that these men understand exactly how the world perceives them. And by your presenting this portrait, they are engaging with that directly, confronting it. And there's a vulnerability and a beauty and a courage in it that's really quite startling. Can you tell us a little bit about this series? This is the one that I first, when I first learned about your work, this is the one that I first saw. You had your exhibition in Berlin this summer, which had great reviews. Congratulations on that. Can you share with the audience more about this series?
Yeah, this series, it really, I became a father. So I was really thinking a lot about fatherhood, my childhood experience, the many people that played that role in terms of, from uncles to coaches to teachers. And I just, began to reflect that obviously as about to become a father, having a lot of conversations. And I wanted to kind of create work that kind of reflected my personal experience on one hand. So a lot of ways, these images pull from, various experiences. Whether it's something that I saw, something that I experienced from someone that was, again, entering my life for a short period of time, again, as a coach or a teacher, as an uncle, but also wanted to think about this idea of masculinity. And, there's often conversations about hypermasculinity and toxic masculinity. But I wanted to kind of show a different counter narrative to that in terms of showing masculinity from a positive sense, being exemplified in one of the ways and being accountable and being responsible, specifically as fathers. So it also, in a lot of ways, is a counter narrative and resistance to, again, a lot of the images and perceptions that are out there as well surrounding Black men. But then as I spend more time with the work, I also begin to think about it politically, that, there's, as you mentioned, there's a bit of a confrontation and vulnerability that's around these images, but there is a larger climate and backdrop to these images in terms of the issue of absence of fathers, particularly in the Black community. And those an issue in our community, it's also an American issue as well. So I think, this series allowed me to serve multiple purposes from a personal standpoint, but also to think about them politically as well.
How many works are in this series?
It's an ongoing series. Right now I've been exhibiting, I think about 4 or 5 images, but it's something that I see that's just ongoing and will continue to progress.
Are these also staged in the way of your first kind of all-American project, or is this more of a more dynamic kind of portrait sitting, or are you choosing the locations and kind of setting up the details, or is this more documentary?
In a lot of ways, a combination of both. I would say I would lean towards more of the staging aspect. The all-American, that process in terms of being in control of every aspect from being very intentional.
I love the detail of the portrait of the grandfather on the wall. I love this, especially hearing your own story about how you came to photography and your thoughts on, how you started making images. I love this detail of the story of images within images, and the drawn image, the photographic image, the likenesses between, or the resemblance between the generations. There's this wonderful kind of interplay within this particular portrait that's really stunning. When I'm thinking about your work, so I'm in the process or working with you to acquire works for our collection. And I'm particularly interested in the fatherhood series, but when looking at your work, I start to think about other works in our collection. So the process of acquiring work, I try to reflect on, okay, what do we already have, and how does it fit with themes and ideas that I'm trying to explore in my collecting and my position here. And I think that one of the things that really interests me in your work is how you work with the everyday people and these kind of everyday details and these everyday moments. But also there's, in your work, there is the construction and the otherworldly and the interior and the kind of sense of a constructed reality. So I love those two, the way those two ideas kind of are working in your own process. And that's kind of what I'm thinking about as we move toward this acquisition. Maybe you can share your thoughts on how you kind of approach reality and fantasy in your work, because we're going to think about that in some of the works coming up, or reflecting on if you would like to say anything about any of these works that you're seeing here from our collection.
Yeah, I think, one of the strategies in terms of using stage photography, again, when I think of Renee Cox's work as well, just being able to have this element of fantasy and kind of dream in a sense, and in terms of the production and the construction of an image. And so when I see the work of Alexis Piskin, his work, Afrofuturism, is one of my favorite genres. I'm a huge sci-fi fan. So again, thinking about the Black experience contextualized in that manner, I think serves a lot of purposes. The more Black art movements and genres that we have, really kind of just increases kind of the intellectual space for artists to explore. And it begins to break a lot of modes and boundaries in terms of what we can do and create. So, and I also hope or plan to, go in that direction. I think a lot about Afrofuturism. I also think a lot about the Black experience from a futuristic perspective. I haven't come to terms of, having it incorporated in my work as of yet. I think I have some works that border that a little bit. But when I see work like that, I just think about the potential and possibility in terms of creating.
Yeah. So, and that's certainly the fantasy, the otherworldly in this other series that I really just find so fascinating. These painted backdrops that you place in these landscapes. And here again, just as in your portraits, the kind of the details, you know, Alizé, this kind of 90s urban drink popularized in songs, you know, all these kinds of details, but also the way in which this painted backdrop appears in this, you know, this beach kind of scene is just so interesting. There's another one, this other one of this car, and there's so much, you know, the kind of photorealistic aspects of the paintings are also just so rich. Tell us a little bit about how, and this draws on your own club photography background.
Mhm.
Can you tell us about the urban landscape series and fantasy and reality?
Mhm. Yeah, similarly to All American, this really marked kind of a shift in my practice as well. You know, I had, you know, after spending a lot of time making a lot of work that was really socially and politically driven, I kind of became fatigued, you know, being in that space. So I had an opportunity at a residency at Martha's Vineyard to produce a new body of work, and I was really just inspired by, you know, the landscape there, on the landscapes on the island, and I began to kind of draw back on my experience as a club photographer, because I would often see, you know, club photography and that experience very separate from more of the kind of fine art photography. But I realized, you know, as I progressed as a photographer and educator, the significance of this cultural practice. So I wanted to kind of bring that into my practice as a way of kind of introducing this aesthetic into the larger photography world, if you will. But also personally wanted to, again, kind of break out of the mode of working with the figure and do something different. So, you know, engaging with the landscape, thinking about space, composition, and lighting from a different perspective. In a lot of ways, it started off as more of an exercise, you know, just setting up these backdrops, thinking about how they relate to the actual environment. You know, having to lug the 4x5 camera around, you know, these backdrops, these sandbags, and, you know, just the challenges that came with that, having to wait for a certain time of day. And then I realized there was, you know, a lot of potential there. And it was also really interesting to think about having the backdrop as the focal point, because often, you know, you have subjects, you know, performing in front of these backdrops. So wanting to kind of push it to the forefront. And, you know, a lot of ways they kind of operate as, you know, relics of a particular era in terms of Black culture, one that, you know, we don't see as prominent today, especially with the advent of, you know, social media and different technologies of that sort. But, you know, it just really marked a shift in my practice and allowed me to really appreciate that experience. And it allowed me to kind of settle my practice in a particular aesthetic, which I am continuing to build upon.
Yeah, I love how in each of these you I can think of every detail here as a particular kind of fantasy, just kind of shaping it a little bit more. Every little highlight, every little glint is, you know, just someone's a fantasy, an idea, all these details. And yes, they are of a moment, and it's fascinating to think of a portrait of a vision, a portrait of a fantasy.
Mm-hmm.
And I just love the way in which they sit in these spaces and how the context in which you place them really, you know, emphasizes their presence, and you treat them as these bodies. And I think they're really fascinating. But you did kind of return to the body in a sense, but in a similar way, also thinking of the backdrop in the High Roller series.
Mm-hmm.
And this is the series, correct, that's in the exhibition right now at MoMA PS1, marking time?
Oh, not this work. It's the work about the prison photography.
Oh, right. Sorry, visiting room. Sorry. But this series as well draws on the backdrop.
Yeah.
The same kind of club aesthetics.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so, as I'm working with the backdrops and again, realizing the significance, I began building upon my own collection. Because at the time when I was shooting, in different clubs and venues, the backdrops are really expensive to make. So I would often just swap with other photographers. So I began collecting backdrops. And as I began doing that, I also began thinking about the Polaroid and the significance of that. Even though I have my own personal collection of digital images, the Polaroid is this one-off, and it has so much history and memory attached to it. So I began collecting these Polaroids, and I knew I wanted to kind of work through them in some particular way. It took a while to kind of figure out what would be, the solution to that. So one of a huge influence was Krista Thompson, her book, The Visual Economy of Light. And she has a whole chapter dedicated to backdrop and club photography. And so thinking about, the bling bling aesthetic, this element of performance and spectacle that's embedded here, I chose to go with, these kind of glitter collages as a way to really insinuate that, but also provided a solution to, wanting to reintroduce the figure, but in a way that wasn't so much about identity. So making these faceless in that regard allowed me to, again, go back to working with the figure, but in a way that was different from my previous works.
So why is it can you get into a little bit about why the choice to withhold the kind of the image of the figure? This is important in the visiting room series. We don't have access to the vision for you.
I think part of it, when you're dealing with subjects, and especially when you're dealing with found material, I'm always kind of mindful of the sense of exploitation and in trying to have a little bit of integrity and being mindful of the subjects, in these photographs. So I think part of it is always trying to find that balance, especially when, you're appropriating material that already exists in that manner. So, and it also just allowed for me to subvert certain elements in terms of allowing other things to really kind of push forward and push through, such as the backdrop, the pose, the silhouette that is present. So really just a solution and strategy in terms of dealing with some of those visual elements.
I'm just asking about if it's also withholding our access to the body is also a response to the ways in which the Black body in popular culture, there is this obsession with looking and with the kind of the voyeurism. And so this decision to withhold reminds me of, strikes me as a response to that as well. I'm just wondering.
Yeah, I think it's a growing, awareness in terms of my practice as it has evolved. I've had previous works that I've created that I no longer show or exhibit for that very reason, just not really being comfortable in terms of the content and the gaze and the placement in which those images would circulate in terms of the audience. So it's something that I'm always aware of and continue to be aware of, and it dictates how I engage with this material.
And so this is the body of work that's up at MoMA PS1, the exhibition, the groundbreaking exhibition based on the book by Nicole Fleetwood, Marking Time, Art in the Age of Mass Incarceration. So this is also a series in which you were using the backdrop, setting up these scenes and not allowing us to see the figure. Since my connection's a little unstable, can you just share with us about this series?
Yeah, I mean, the series was born out of a few experiences. One, as I began to dive into more club photography, aesthetics, and the Polaroids and backdrops, I began to see a connection between an archive that I have been collecting or building for some time. I had two uncles that were incarcerated. And they were incarcerated around the same time for about 10 years in separate prisons. And these are our brothers. And we would write each other and send each other letters and pictures. So my introduction to kind of prison photography aesthetics began there. And I had created a small series based on some of those images that I collected from my uncles. But as I began to focus on, the club photography Polaroids, I began to see this relationship in terms of the use of the backdrop. And also, in a lot of instances, the pose was really similar as well between these two particular practices. So I think that, the power and importance of agency in these particular settings was something that was, really important. So I also wanted to kind of engage with it in a way that kind of subverted the carceral gaze. And again, relying on, the strategy of making them faceless, which really allows the viewer in a lot of ways to kind of contemplate the perspective of the sitter. Sometimes it allows you to place yourself in the image, but it also kind of pushes back against our gaze as well. So that the series was really born out of those particular experiences. I didn't find a lot of, or hardly any scholarship that really talked about the relationship between the two. So I thought it was a really interesting opportunity to really kind of engage with these two aesthetics in a way that I haven't seen often in terms of scholarship and also in fine art.
And now you are working on a new, before we go on, this one I really find so interesting just because of the way in which the sitter is posed and how he or she, I can't quite tell, how they seem to be looking up at this car. And this really does bring together, to me, this kind of interaction between the role of the backdrop as this kind of fantasy space, and as a space that is actually active within the scene. It's not just a passive element. It actually is a space that is actively engaged. And then here again, I start to look at the details, the highlights on the window, and in the front of the car, and the brand of the car, the turn of the wheels, all of these details that make this scene so active versus just a passive static backdrop.
Yeah, this was also a way of, I didn't want it to just simply recreate the images that were, in the Polaroids that I collected. I wanted to kind of, break that a little bit. So part of it is, again, having the sitter turn away from the camera. So, this relationship between the backdrop, the sitter, the viewer, and then, as you mentioned, having the backdrop and a really active component in terms of the actual image itself.
So now you're working on this series, Internal External Splendor. It's so fascinating how your work gets further and further into elements of construction and conceptualism, but still so grounded in these wonderful eye for these realistic elements of everyday life and their meaning. Can you tell us about this work, this new body of work?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so as I said, I began collecting prison Polaroids, and even though I was able to find a solution to the club Polaroids in terms of the glitter effect, I didn't think that would be appropriate for these particular images. So it kind of took me a while to kind of find a solution in terms of dealing with this material. And as a result of the pandemic, and being inside and not being able to go out and shoot, I was really forced to really work with this material and work through the material. So one of the things I began to look out for was, this relationship between, these escapist backdrops that often depict, beachscapes or cityscapes and, waterfalls and everything else. So I wanted to kind of merge that element within the actual silhouette of the subjects. As a way to kind of rethink or redefine ways of how we think of escapism and freedom. One from a physical sense, but also from a more symbolic perspective as well.
And so in some of them, they really are really merging. It's interesting how in this one, the top of the figure, the relationship with the background is so different from the bottom.
Mm-hmm.
I love that kind of subtle transition that happens. Are these fragments of are they enlarged? It's so, I'm trying to think about how they are constructed. Do you enlarge and then abstract? Like, how is this the actual backdrop undistorted?
Yeah, so like in the first image, I began collecting Polaroids of landscapes. So I would essentially collage that landscape Polaroid into the silhouette of the figures in the prison Polaroid. And then in the second image, just pulling from the actual backdrop, the mural that's present here, and then collaging that into the silhouette.
Ah.
So, that was one way of working. And then what I began to also do is I began removing the figures completely from these prison Polaroids. So kind of creating these constructed landscapes. And I thought it was kind of really interesting to think about, one, the absence of subject, but also what these spaces kind of entail when you kind of remove those figures. It was something also just kind of gratifying in I guess in a more symbolic gesture of just kind of removing the inmates from this particular space as well. And just kind of, something that I'm still kind of working through in terms of, what it means and the implication of it. I was definitely inspired by Michael Samarov's work with August, his work with August Sanders' portraits, where he began to remove the subject and pushing the background to the forefront. So, kind of borrowing from, those kind of aesthetic choices and thinking about, mass incarceration, thinking about freedom, thinking about landscape as well, and finding ways to weave those things together.
Larry, if you're up for it, we've got some great questions from our audience. If you want to take one just about the internal external Splendor series, someone's just asked about the scale of these works. How large are they? And are you rephotographing the Polaroid then in these works?
So they're not rephotographed. So the Polaroids are scanned at a high res scan and just, digitally, manipulated. But in contrast to the club Polaroid images that I did, which were slightly larger than the original size, these are 16 by 16 inches.
Okay.
And it's also, it was a way of, again, as I'm always kind of thinking about my practice and my photography and pushing it in different directions and different ways. And because the element of the landscape is so important, to me, the scale and increasing it was seemed appropriate.
Fantastic. I'm going to take us back a little bit to the All-American series, one of our first questions, and we have a lot of them, and I'm not going to get to them all, but this participant is wondering about what you are hoping the viewer will take away from the All-American series in terms of racial injustice. And I'm also curious about the scale of those works. How large are the figures in those photographs? Hey, Makeda.
So the images are that particular triptych, each image is 40 by 50 inches.
Okay.
I think in terms of racial injustice, I think, again, part of it was a bit of wanting to show the hypocrisy in terms of the response to issues of violence. So again, within our community, and it's something that is relevant today as it was when I created it, and is always a topic of debate. So I think that really I put a lot more of the onus on the viewer to wrestle with those connections. I mean, if they come to that conclusion, that's great. There are other threads that they're able to pull and unpack from the series. A lot of my work is, relying on certain signifiers and kind of having this minimalistic approach in dealing with content that is really heavy, but having a more kind of subtle approach in terms of allowing viewers to really engage with the work. So though, there's a genesis in terms of how the work was created, but how it operates in the world in terms of how the viewer responds, I really like to put a lot of it on the viewer.
Thanks, Larry. Makeda, did you have any wrap-up remarks before we go to more questions, or?
No, I see there's a lot of questions, so I'll just let them.
Okay. All right. So the next person is asking about how the backdrops were prepared, and it sounds like you're collecting these, and I'm curious about this archive. It sounds like that you're kind of assembling to of these backdrops. Can you speak a little more about that?
Yeah, the backdrops that I've always been interested in, and when I was working, the ones that were really popular were the hand-painted backdrops, and oftentimes they would be airbrushed as well. So it would be various artists who would, create these backdrops, and then, we would, pay for the backdrops. As I mentioned at the time, I didn't have a lot of money, so I couldn't afford to pay, $400 for a backdrop. So, I would buy one from other photographers that, was much more experienced. And there was a particular photographer who really introduced me to this industry, if you will. So he was a source. Began meeting with different photographers in the area who've had various collections of backdrops. So part of it was this importance of archiving and preserving this material, but also was working with them and helping them realize the importance of the material that they have. So making sure that they're scanning their images and creating and backing up their work and proper ways of managing and having the backdrop stored. There's a photographer in New Orleans, Polo Silk. He goes by the name Polo Silk. And his collection is really valuable because his collection of backdrops and Polaroids were able to survive Katrina. And he's been getting a lot of attention. And so we've been having conversations for the past 2 or 3 years in terms of just being aware of not giving the original copy, having high-res copies, having multiple hard drives backing up these images, having the correct value on these backdrops as people are wanting to buy them from them. So it's really just in terms of the production and the collecting of it, just being really aware of the importance of this material, and then also thinking about how these materials circulate, and who is providing the context of this particular type of aesthetic, and just wanting to be part of that discussion, in part because it's part of my also personal experience as a photographer.
It's great, and it has this long history in the history of photography as well. We had a question wondering about if you are at all interested or inspired by West African studio photography.
Absolutely. That type of photography, even going back to James Vandersea, that everyday Black life, but kind of celebration of, the prestige and being aware of, representation. So that's definitely a huge part in terms of the material that I engage, from the Polaroids, the backdrops, and also even to some degree, even the prison work as well.
Going to the prison work, there's a question about how you chose the backdrops for the Visiting Room series. Why the cityscape?
I think I wanted to choose backdrops that was more aligned with the images that I would see in terms of the prison archives. Because there is, for a largely, there is a contrast between the club backdrops where you see a lot more materialistic elements from the wine bottles and the exotic cars that kind of represents this kind of longing for this type of high class type of culture. And in contrast to, you know, the more escapist backdrops with the landscapes about, you know, being free and having a backdrop that kind of strips away the context, if you will, of being in prison.
And there's a question about the poses of the sitters. Some of them are sort of seated or squatting. Can you tell us about the decision to choose those poses? Yeah,
because again, it's something that is a staple in the, you know, prison photography aesthetic. It's you know, as Richard Majors described as the cool pose, where, you know, it's this element of masculinity, of being detached and kind of claiming this agency. And I always, you know, found that to be extremely powerful, because even in that particular circumstance, in that environment, you know, the little agency that they have, they really exemplify it in you know, this vernacular photography that kind of operates as a parallel in a lot of ways to fine art photography.
Going back to another question about some of your influences, you mentioned Carrie Mae Weems and Gordon Parks, but someone's wondering about what about Greg Crutzen or Katie Grannon or other photographers who have staged scenes with large format view cameras to construct reality? In other words, do you see a connection with the history of this fine art staged photography more generally with your work?
Yeah, absolutely, definitely Greg Crutzen. I remember seeing an Art 21 special about his work, and I was just amazed at the scale and, you know, the production of that work and the different approach to photography. So again, his work, Renee Cox, Carrie Mae Weems, those type of photographers definitely had an influence in how I began to approach my photography as well.
Maybe there's something there, Larry. There's a difference there, though. It's your work is not as cinematic. I mean, it's constructed, but it's not veering towards cinema, which is an interesting distinction that you're kind of showing between the potential of this genre.
Yeah, that's true. I think it's more just kind of borrowing on the idea of being able to construct an image, and to which degree and to the extent in which you kind of embark upon that. So though I think my images are more kind of rooted in reality, I'm still kind of borrowing from that particular process and approach and dealing with the material.
Well, it's also in that way, you're borrowing from a visual culture that is not always material. It is about fantasy. It is about, you know, a spoken and a shared thinking about other spaces and other ways of being. And sometimes that manifests itself in actual form, but sometimes it's just shared between people. You know, I'm thinking of people just telling stories about, you know, what you wish you'll have someday. And so there's this other way in which you're engaging a construction that draws on a visual culture that's not necessarily material, but it's still very vivid in everyday life in urban Black America in particular.
I think we've got probably time for one last question. I don't know, Makeda, if you have any final questions before we wrap up.
No, I just want to thank Larry for sharing with us. This has been really exciting to see so much work in such a short time. I wish we could have done it in person, but I think it's also great that we're able to share you and all of this work with with our audience and with a wider audience beyond.
Yeah, thank you so much, Larry. I think it would be great. I think we maybe can invite you back once the museum's open and people can come see your work in person at the Harvard Art Museum. So thank you so much, Makeda. Thank you, Larry. Thank you to everyone who participated in today's session. I want to invite everyone to join our next session, which is on November 20th at 11 a.m. It's about finding solace in rituals, led by our Chief Curator, So-Young Lee. And we will be following up this seminar today with an email sharing an object list of the works we shared today, some links to related articles about Larry's work and his website, a short survey, and a link to register for the next seminar. So thank you again, Larry and Makeda and everyone who joined us today. Have a great weekend.
Thank you, guys.